Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Shaharzad Akbar, and Shaharzad is the chair of the Independent Afghanistan Human Rights Commission. So it's a real privilege to have you on the Godcast. Shaharzad, how are you?
Thank you. I'm really honored to be part of this conversation and to meet you. Thank you. I'm okay.
Okay. Where in the world are you today, Shaharzad?
I'm in Istanbul, Turkey.
And you've been there for a little while now. Did you go straight there from Afghanistan?
Almost. I first went to Egypt for a few days and then came to Istanbul.
Okay. Well, let's get down to this this terrible situation in Afghanistan at the moment, Shaharzad, and it strikes me that for much of the media, certainly in the United Kingdom, I can't perhaps speak for the rest of the Western world, but the 24-hour news coverage seemed to finish the minute the Americans left Afghanistan. Would that be your understanding of the situation?
Yes, I mean, there is definitely some attention from specific circles or humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations that have been involved in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, of course, the broader media coverage of Afghanistan is gone. It has been gone for a few years. In fact, it did spike again with the withdrawal and kind of the attention to the fate of the international military in Afghanistan and their withdrawal. That's why our lives came back to focus a little bit. But unfortunately, as you said, yes, it's out of focus again, but the situation is dire. It's worse than it has been in the past 20 years at least. The humanitarian situation is dire. While there are de facto authorities, Taliban, there is in fact a lack of any meaningful form of governance and delivery of services. And of course, the human rights abuses have continued or have gotten worse in some cases.
Shaharzad, just give us a real insight into what life is like in Afghanistan, particularly since the West has left. Just give us some anecdotal evidence, if you would.
So the assets of Afghanistan have been frozen because Taliban are a sanctions list. Banks are not delivering services as per usual. So government employees have not been paid salaries. So that means teachers, that means doctors, essential healthcare providers, people that could count on a regular income in a very poor country. They haven't been paid salaries. People cannot withdraw money from banks, even if there are transfers to their bank accounts from relatives outside Afghanistan. Women have basically, their ability to lead a public life has shrunk and dramatically. So as a woman, most professional women who had jobs 3 months ago have no longer jobs and don't know what will the future hold for them. They have to bury their dreams and ambitions in terms of a professional life. Girls in most of Afghanistan can't go to school beyond primary school. And people that I knew, friends who were in a position to help others financially, to take care of extended family just 3-4 months ago, are now in need of financial assistance themselves, so that they and their children do not starve. So it's a very bleak and grim picture, both in terms of humanitarian situation and the human rights situation, with a lot of uncertainty about what the next few months hold. In fact, I can't tell you with certainty what will Afghanistan look like in 6 months from now, and I fear for the worst.
Yeah, and just kind of to give that some perspective to people in the UK, maybe to an average family home in Afghanistan, what would an average family home feel like, Shaharzad, and what would their kind of living circumstances what would they be like in terms of sanitation and electricity and gas at the moment?
I mean, the electricity services are being provided, but I'm not sure if people are able to pay for them anymore. But I think average Afghan household right now is struggling to feed itself. So the biggest thing on the minds of every average Afghan family is, what will we eat for dinner? What will we eat tomorrow for breakfast? Beyond that, what is our future going to look like in 3 months from now, in 6 months from now? Will our children have access to healthcare? Will our children have education, especially daughters? So unsurprisingly, a lot of people are trying to leave. trying everything to leave, as we saw during the evacuation. But of course, that has continued. More than 5,000 people show up at the borders in Iran today. People show up at the border with Pakistan every day. And everyone that I speak to, particularly women, they don't see a future for themselves in Afghanistan, at least in the short and medium term.
And there's great risk, isn't there, by going? I was reading about this, about going to the Iranian borders and the Pakistani borders. A lot of these people are going without visas or passports, and are being turned back, and then subsequently they're kind of heading to the desert to try and gain access illegally. That must be putting people's lives at great risk. Yeah, so anyone who decides to travel illegally to one of these countries, of course, they are at grave risk. There's mistreatment, if not worse, by the border police. Smugglers, mistreatment by smugglers who promise that they will take people in. And sometimes people basically, well, most times people sell whatever they have. They basically put all their lives, all they have, into getting out, and they lose all they have into getting out. And so they have nothing to come back to in their own communities. If they had a piece of land, they have sold it. If they had some belongings, they have sold it. If they had to take loans, they have already taken loans that they need to pay back, in the hopes that they will go somewhere else and will be able to find work. And what is the prospect for these people if they even actually manage to gain access to Iran? There's no guarantees, are there?
No, I mean, these two countries have hosted, Iran and Pakistan have hosted Afghan refugees for a long time, but Afghan refugees in these countries have very little legal rights in terms of access to education, access to healthcare services, and access to legal employment. And so they are going from something really bad, but they're not going to something that's better, really. Maybe there is relative safety and some income, but beyond that, again, they're living in a limbo. They're living in a limbo, in a legal limbo, and they're living in a situation of uncertainty about the future of their children. I have been a refugee in Pakistan. When I was younger, my family and we went to Pakistan, my family went to Pakistan. And I have firsthand experienced the challenges of a refugee life. I mean, my parents couldn't officially legally work, and we went to private schools, Afghan schools. Some Afghans would be running some schools with some international assistance, but we weren't sure if our documents would ever be considered legitimate in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, our school certificates or diplomas. So that's the kind of situation that they're dealing with. And we were among the luckier ones who had some family and relatives in the West who could send us some money to sustain ourselves. Of course, not everybody has that.
Gosh, and something I've heard absolutely nothing about. I can't see anything anywhere. Is the effect of COVID-19 on the country, on top of all the problems that are already there? What is the situation there regarding COVID, Shaharzad?
So Afghanistan, I mean, in terms of COVID-19, we were already struggling with the fact of lack of adequate healthcare facilities. And at that time, there were restrictions in place. So big gatherings, they weren't always implemented, but there were restrictions in place to prevent big gatherings. And there was ongoing public awareness campaigns about the symptoms and what you should do if you feel the symptoms and how you should self-isolate. I think most of that's not happening right now because the Ministry of Public Health does not have the resources to continue doing that work. So it's basically just, you know, if you're unlucky to suffer, if you're unlucky to have kind of the stronger side of the symptoms, then you're most likely to not make it. And it's really surprising to me that the de facto authorities, there's no conversation about COVID. They have even stopped offering, like Afghanistan would every day give news of how many people have been infected, how many people have been cured. That has also completely stopped. So we don't have a clear picture unless it's anecdotal.
And is the vaccine being rolled out there? Are people actually getting the vaccine?
It was being rolled out, so I got vaccinated in Afghanistan. Both doses of my vaccine, and all of our staff in the commission were vaccinated in Afghanistan. But I think that has also, the vaccination campaign has also stopped.
Yeah.
Or at least I don't hear about it in the media.
And all this is with the backdrop of, I was reading on the BBC News that 95% of the population are now at risk of starvation, which is quite an horrific statistic. That's pretty grim, Shaharzad, isn't it?
It can be the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world. If not more is being done right now. That means that if you and everyone you know is at risk of starvation, basically. So imagine living in a neighborhood, you're at risk of starvation, but you can't turn to neighbors for help, and you can't turn to extended relatives for help, because guess what? They are in a similar situation like you. You're all in the same boat. Afghanistan, I mean, we have suffered some really difficult times, but what really got us through was the fact that always there was this willingness to contribute in the community. So we had one of the biggest internally displaced people in Afghanistan in terms of numbers because of the conflict in the past 20 years. But our city somehow absorbed them, not because government was delivering services, but because people opened their homes to relatives, to extended family, and took them in and tried to host them and shelter them if they were running away from a conflict in their own province or in their own district. Now that no one is in a position to provide that kind of support to someone else, right? So it's a challenge. Daily we keep hearing about new villages, which is good to hear, but it seems like the aid is having a lot of difficulty to get to everyone in time. It's not fast enough. It's not effective enough. So, yeah. But the usual challenges of humanitarian aid are being further complicated by the fact that Taliban are in power, and Taliban are not extremely cooperative across Afghanistan.
And that humanitarian aid, is that coming? Well, I guess it's coming predominantly from charitable organisations rather than countries. Is that correct?
It's mostly countries, actually, but it's channeled through the UN. But there are also charitable organizations on the ground, of course, that are working and delivering aid. So it's both of those things. The UN pledge is not fully funded, what UN asked for, but it's being. We hear news that it will be, there will be more and more funding provided. We hope that's true. In the meantime, a lot of countries are struggling with the fact that some of them have some really complicated policies around delivering aid to a country that has, as its de facto authorities, people who are on sanctions lists, which is, in this case, of course, Taliban authorities are sanctioned as terrorists by UN Sanctions Committee. So that complicates development aid. Humanitarian aid is never sufficient on its own, but also in some cases, even humanitarian aid, because people worry about the aid somehow benefiting the Taliban members directly, or fighters, or people who are on sanctions lists. So it's not only a problem of lack of resources, but it's also about political issues around the sanctions list that's complicating the situation, the economic situation.
And what was your driving force, Shaharzad, to be a voice and speak up? What was the thing that kind of engaged you with these matters? Can you just share a bit of that with us?
I mean, sure, yes. I mean, when I was growing up, one of the core values in my family was your value does not come from how successful you are. It comes from how much you can help others around you. So my parents never defined for us success as, you must get high grades and you must have a well-paid job. It was about how much are you doing for other people today, people outside of yourselves, be it your family, your community, people around you. What's the impact that you're having in the world? And that has been a core value which I have, of course, regularly fallen short of, I must say. But in terms of being taught that value, that was very important, and that was a guiding principle and decisions that I made professionally and personally. So I think that was a key factor. But also having lived in a country in conflict, having lived in a country struggling with poverty, being a refugee, having gone through poverty as a child, as a conflict as a child, of course it's horrific and traumatic, and I struggle with the trauma of it. But it enriched my life in the sense that I think it enhanced my ability to empathize with people in situations that are very, very different. So I wasn't brought up in like, I didn't have a sheltered life. I saw all these things firsthand and the impact that it could have on a child or a young person. And I don't want other children, if I can, I want to do something about other children not experiencing them.
So what did you experience that you don't want children of Afghanistan to experience? What did you go through?
I grew up in war. I became familiar with conflict when I was very young, 5-6 years old. You know, when we were displaced by war, and when we were displaced, we had to walk miles and miles. I saw dead bodies of killed people who have been killed on war on the street. We lost neighbors, and I saw poverty firsthand, and the ability to lead a dignified life when you don't have your basic needs met, right? It's very difficult. That sense of humiliation that comes from something that's not your fault at all. It's not your fault that you can't meet your basic needs, but you still feel humiliated about it. And you feel embarrassed and you feel ashamed for some reason. And I don't want any child anywhere to experience that. Not just Afghan children, but of course we are very, very unfortunately far away from that world. I don't know why. I mean, it shouldn't be this way, of course, but we are very far away. And I think it breaks me down every day, because looking at the situation in Afghanistan, I'm reliving the trauma that I and my family and my friends and my husband and his family and everyone that I know experienced as children. And we were hoping to make a difference so that it wouldn't happen again. And we failed. We failed in making that difference, that lasting difference. And that's a huge burden, I think, that we struggle with.
It's very sad, isn't it? Did you feel you were making progress before the West left? Did you feel that there was kind of the green shoots of a new harvest of young people?
I mean, absolutely. I think the last few years were very difficult. We kept losing comrades and friends, and the security situation kept getting worse. And there was less and less hope in our political leadership, and there was less certainty about the future. But still, till the very last moment, of course, unless you have hope, you don't risk your life every day, right? You have some hope that kind of gives you the strength to go out there every day and risk your life and risk your family's life, because you think it might make a difference. Otherwise, why risk your life? And so my colleagues and I, because I wasn't only risking my own life, I was asking people to risk their lives for human rights in Afghanistan, not explicitly asking them, but by being their chair, by leading this organization. So I was conscious of that every day, that I'm leading this organization that's literally asking people for their lives for this kind of work. Because I had hope that a lot of countries have gone through conflict or struggling with conflict, but conflict can't be permanent, and it ends one day. And the seeds that we have planted, they will take root. Not all of them can be killed or destroyed. Many of them are, but not all of them. And I still believe in that, in the sense that I believe that there are seeds that we all have collectively planted in Afghanistan for human rights, for a better future, that are there. and you see women protesting in Kabul, despite like the courage of that woman. It humbles me every time. How can they do that? How can they go out and stand there with Taliban and their guns and they ask for the right to work, the right to education? It's incredible. So the seeds are there. I know they are there. But this setback is just so devastating. It just feels like back to zero again. And, we had built institutions, they were very flawed. We had progress, it was extremely flawed. One of the reasons that it didn't hold was that it was so flawed. But there were lights, small pockets of light that would continue to give us hope. And now it's much harder to have hope.
My worry is that these young women who have had access to universities and education and are being academically developed are in danger of becoming martyrs. I worry that they will protest and shout and they'll just be slayed by the Taliban. Is that the likely outcome?
I mean, we all have a lot of concern for their safety, and it's very difficult. While I'm inspired by their bravery, I'm very hesitant to encourage necessarily, right? Because of the issues that you have highlighted, because of the fear for their safety and the safety of their families and people around them. And we are continuously tracking the situation on the ground, trying to get a sense of how are civil society activists being treated. But I think now the focus of all of us should be, of course, the humanitarian crisis and resolving the humanitarian crisis, but also opening space inside Afghanistan, finding ways to open space in Afghanistan, inside the country. The Taliban should understand that if they want to govern, right, they are not governing a graveyard. They're governing an actual diverse country where a lot of people do not agree with them. And unless they create peaceful platforms for people to express their opinions, the consequences will not just be for the people who disagree with them, it will be for the country. It will be for the entire nation. You'll either lose your best because they're running away because they have no space inside the country, which has already happened to a large extent in Afghanistan, or you'll have people who could be constructive players in the society turning to violence because they don't have means to express their opinion and to pursue their objectives in a non-violent manner. So Taliban, if they're realistic about governing, they have to open space. Afghanistan is a very diverse country. And Afghanistan, I mean, we have neighbors, we are in a region, that Afghanistan, despite its conflict, despite the fact that media were regularly targeted and killed, it had one of the highest numbers of journalists killed in action, Afghanistan had the most vibrant media in region, most independent compared to even big democracies like India. There's a culture of people wanting to say what they believe and people believing they have the right to say what they believe. And if Taliban want to attack this aspect of our culture, then, there won't be just consequences for those who are protesting. So I do think that this would be one of the biggest challenges for Taliban, to really think through the implications of their policy on providing space or not providing space. And the world is watching, and of course there will be continuous pressure. And I mean, I can't say with certainty what the future. Again, I have been so humbled by what happened in Afghanistan, how quickly things changed, that I don't feel like I have the wisdom to say, oh, this might happen. Even kind of put several scenarios ahead as possible scenarios. But I know that this is not sustainable.
And when people talk about the Taliban, Shaharzad, it strikes me that it's kind of just a word. It's kind of, who are the Taliban? Who are they? Are they a group of hierarchy? Are they self-governed? Just give some people the perspective of actually who the Taliban are.
I mean, first and foremost, they are an insurgency. Like, they are a militant group. They had some background in governance, failed background in governance, I would say, from 1996 to 2001. But for the most, especially because of the past 20 years of war, for the most part, the most prominent aspect of their identity, which people forget and the US forgot, obviously, is that the fact that they're a militant, hardcore Islamist group, and they are an insurgency. They know how to fight. They know how to recruit to fight. When it comes to governance, especially governing a big, complicated country, everyone is learning very quickly that they don't have it together. They don't know. They don't know how a government should function. They don't know what are the political compromises required to govern a diverse country, diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of opinions, language. And they have some level of cohesion. I think they had better cohesion when they were fighting because they had one united objective, not so many resources and problems to think through. There was just one problem: kill as many security forces as possible, create as much terror as possible, kill as many foreigners as possible. That was relatively straightforward for them. Now, with this complex new situation where they're in charge, it's very hard for them to find common ground, even within themselves, which makes it very complicated for them then to deliver services to Afghans, to meet the conditions required for them to receive international aid, etc., etc. So they are in a pickle. And they are taking their time, despite people starving. They are just taking their time to figure these things out. I'm shocked. I mean, I don't expect much from Taliban, but I did expect that they would care about starvation, like actual starvation. But it does seem like, I don't know, even on that, they're moving very slowly.
It worries me that they'll just be governing a shell. You know, they'll just be governing it like you described earlier, effectively a graveyard.
Yeah.
If something doesn't happen soon. And you know, as a Protestant priest, Shaharzad, often people say to me, you know, most wars in the world are about religion. Is this, in your opinion, a religious war, or is this just a terrorist organization trying to get their will over a weak nation?
I mean, I think it's that conflict in Afghanistan is very, very complex, right? I guess all conflicts are complex, but I think the conflict that I know, the Afghan conflict that I know, it's very complex. There are regional dimensions to it, something that Afghans kept talking about, but really didn't manage to resolve. There's, of course, ideological plus religious dimensions to it. The Taliban do claim religious legitimacy. They do claim that their war against the government, the previous government, had religious legitimacy. They do see God as the source of their legitimacy. So not delivery of services or governance. They think that they are now in power because it was the will of God. And if they keep praying 5 times and fasting, they will remain in power forever, I guess. That's what they think, I guess. Some of them at least. So of course, the religious aspect cannot be underplayed, but it's important to remember that Afghanistan is a religious society. Majority of Afghans are Muslim, and majority of Afghans are conservative Muslims. So the Taliban's war was against a Muslim society. The Afghan government in power was a Muslim state. It wasn't a secular state. Our laws were enshrined in religious texts. This is something that, as a human rights activist, was a challenge. Sometimes different religious interpretations. It was a challenge. Our laws were not always in line with our international human rights commitments. And the definitions that we had as human rights activists about issues like, you know, the rights of a woman in marriage did not align with what the existing laws and structures dictated, which were mostly based on religion. So I think in understanding Taliban's claim to religious legitimacy, we do have to always remember that their interpretation of religion does not represent majority of Afghans. So majority of Afghans, you would see, at least around girls' education, you would see that Afghans from rural parts of the country, uneducated Afghans, are saying the schoolgirls should open. Girls should be able to go to school till grade 12. what Taliban are implementing in practice is very different than that, of course, we know. Or when Taliban were fighting against the Afghan government, and at the same time they were talking to, well, non-Muslims, the Americans, there was an overwhelming demand from the public and from religious scholars around the world for a ceasefire. They said this war has no longer any legitimacy. You are saying that you're fighting against a foreign intervention. You have signed an agreement with the foreigners, with the quote-unquote invaders. You're not attacking them any longer. You're just attacking your fellow Muslims. And this has no religious legitimacy. Taliban paid no heed to this overwhelming demand from religious scholars and Muslim leaders from across the world. Or suicide attacks. All prominent religious scholars would argue that there's no place for suicide in Islam. In fact, it's considered a sin, which has its own complications, of course, from a human rights perspective. But suicide attacks were the prominent tactic used by Taliban in suicide attacks against civilians. So there's a lot that the religious community disagrees with the Taliban on, including, for instance, the fact that they have a very different definition of civilians than what is there in laws of war in Islam. So they would attack prosecutors, people who are not carrying a gun. They will attack them and target them and kill them, saying these people are enemy and we should treat them as military targets. So that's the context to it. It's complex, I guess, and it has a history. It's not devoid of history. Taliban did not just develop in you know, an organic movement that really developed in Afghanistan in the 90s. The fact is that there is a longer history of violent political Islam that was invested on and supported by the US in the region because of its rivalry with the Soviet Union. And even earlier than that, because of the regional dynamics, powers like the UK and others were involved in mobilizing religious scholars, the religious class, against sitting governments in Afghanistan. So there is a history of colonialism. There is a history of, you know, the kind of the political militant Islam. There's a global context to it with the Soviet-US rivalry. And it's amazing to me, of course, I mean, day-to-day conversations, people forget, you don't expect ordinary citizens to go to this level of nuance. But it's amazing to me that political leaders, for their political objectives in the global West, let's say, really underplay all these undercurrents and their contribution. You know, particularly when President Biden talks about what happened in Afghanistan over the past few months, it completely amazes me, and it just, I really can't process it, because he seems to be putting all the blame on Afghans. This is not this is not a monster that we created on our own. Not at all. We weren't capable. We were a very poor country. We weren't capable of doing this. There's a lot of history here, including multiple US mistakes and neglect. And yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the messages from the victory of Taliban and the agreement that US made with them, which came with 0 conditions, basically, is that now you see IS employing the same tactics against Taliban. So unfortunately, this cycle, right? So there's always someone who claims that they're more religious than you, they're more righteous than you, and that allows them to kill you. And so now that's what the IS is doing to Taliban.
Goodness me, Shaharzad, it is a real mess, isn't it? And what do you think the political intent of countries like Pakistan and Iran is? What is their desired outcome for Afghanistan? Is it just to watch it kind of self-combust and then pick up the pieces in years to come? Do you think there's a political intention from these countries?
I think there is not a common regional agenda. That has been one of the problems. There's a lot of regional rivalry and people wanting different things. And, you know, because US was there always trying to sort out any mess that was there, they sort of became over-reliant on the US. And I think they didn't really fully think through the consequences of US withdrawal in terms of the situation in Afghanistan. So while for some reason, some countries in the region may have wanted a US withdrawal, although most of them said they want a responsible withdrawal, but they didn't think through what the implications of that would be then in terms of governance in Afghanistan and their own interests in Afghanistan. Right now, I think everyone is trying to figure it out a little bit. Maybe Pakistan has more of a clear sense and knew what to expect. But I think other players in the region are trying to figure out, and they are, like, honestly, it's a huge headache for them. Refugees are at their doors. Huge numbers of refugees are at their doors. There are huge security threats because of IS. And there's not much confidence in Taliban's ability to control them or want to control other terrorist groups. And now they are like, oops, and US is not here to kind of pay the bill or, support an army or whatnot. And so I think they are all struggling a little bit, yeah.
And what about yourself in all this, Shaharzad? It must take its toll on you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has been very difficult and dark few months, and it's hard to really look ahead. It's still a challenge really for me to look ahead and think, when will it be that I would have a bit more hope? There's also a lot of guilt. I think it's not unique to me. People who leave their countries or forced to leave their countries feel a lot of guilt about that. So I do feel a lot of guilt about the fact that I'm in a position of relative privilege. I don't have to face the same problems ordinary Afghans are facing every day. That makes me feel I don't know if there should be some gratitude, of course, but there's a lot of guilt around that. And to try to move from guilt to action, that's my struggle right now. How do I change this guilt into action? Make peace with the guilt. Realize that I'll have to live with it. It's an emotion. It's an emotion that shows that I care, and it's not an emotion that is easy or pleasant, but it's part of me. And then how do I take this guilt and try to make myself useful?
Yeah. And do you think you can do that in Turkey? I mean, Turkey is a hugely influential country on the world stage. What is your understanding of Turkey's position with this? Are they in a position of influence, or are they like other nations, kind of sitting back and waiting to see what happens?
They would like to be in a position of influence, but I'm not sure to what extent they are. It does seem like Taliban have been really emboldened by their victory, to the extent that people who had influence on them, like the Qataris and Pakistanis, are now struggling to have an influence because they feel really, I think they're a little unrealistic about the mess that they are in, Taliban, I mean, and they feel extremely emboldened by their military victory. So I think the situation in Afghanistan remains so fluid, and the dynamics between these countries and Afghanistan, that it's hard to tell with certainty right now what will the role be for Turkey, or what will the role be for some other more distant neighbors, I guess. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my own work, I think I do want to have a period to reflect, to think through. It's really long, but the past 20 years, and to think through about what's possible next. And if I do anything, I want to do it in a kind of try to do. I might fail in a thoughtful way. I don't want to rush. I know time is of the essence. I'll continue doing the advocacy that I can in the meantime, but for doing more concrete things, I have a lot of questions, Alex. I mean, I'm trying to get a clear picture of how things are back home. I want to make sure that my work does not take away from work. Is not distant from the realities on the ground. I do think that sometimes in diaspora, people tend to advocate for causes that that might not make a lot of sense to people who are actually on the ground. So I'm conscious of that.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not on my own. I have colleagues now who are outside Afghanistan who are struggling with the same questions. So trying to find collective solutions. And people who care about Afghanistan, want to continue doing some work around Afghanistan, on Afghanistan, all of these factors come into play. Yeah. It's complex.
Do you think you'll ever go home? Do you think you'll ever return?
Yes, I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, I hope sooner than later. Yeah, I haven't made that decision in my mind that I'm not going back. Again, the situation is so much in flux. You don't know what you'll be looking at in a year from now, I think. And so yes, I very much hope so that I'll be able to go to home. I don't think in the immediate future right now, there aren't even commercial flights to Kabul, but
nice.
Even if I wasn't, you know, like because of my work at Target, but yeah, I hope. My mom and I keep talking about this. We keep talking about wanting to go for spring. You know, our new year starts on 21st March, so we have hope. We have hope.
Well, Shaharzad, it's been really helpful, I think, for people who are going to watch this to understand the context of what's happening there, and it's a desperately sad situation, and I'm just so grateful for what you've been doing and the voice and the advocate you've been for the humanitarian crisis, and I understand that the guilt that you must feel, but people in Afghanistan need people like you to keep championing their situation, and if we can ever help. Or just one final thing, Shaharzad, if there was one thing you'd like to say to people of the UK who might watch this about Afghanistan, what would your message be to them?
I would say it's not just Taliban in Afghanistan, it's the Afghan people, and they need support. Encourage your governments to engage. It's hard. It's really hard engaging with Taliban. I don't want to engage with Taliban, but we all have a duty to care, duty of care for Afghans as citizens of this world, as people, as humans, as our fellow sisters and brothers, and the children there. So don't let your governments forget, and encourage them to engage, to help Afghans, ordinary Afghans.
Thank you, Shaharzad, and I send my love and prayers to you from Lancashire in England, and I just thank you for your time, and thank you for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Take care.